I'm Jordan Valdina. I'm a registered architect and a professional engineer. Designing spaces and connecting people to places they love is what I do. Using the material in this program, my hope is that I may inspire and provide value to you in your journey through our built environment. This is the Architecture Show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Architecture Show. This one we're going to talk about context and trends, and they actually go together, very much so. There's nothing separable from context. Never. What is context? It's a blurry line sometimes between background and foreground, between context and activity within context. The two are constantly affecting and evolving one another. So much so that one might say it's an artificial division. And yet somehow it's helpful to us to see this, the object, and that around it, the context. However, they're in a constant communication, and as we said, perhaps they're not really best thought of as separate at all. Anyway, the context for architecture. What we need, right? Architecture fundamentally is for people. It's for us. There's dimensions that relate to accommodating a function, is generally how we think of it, because it's centered in ourselves outward. For an animal, or animals, or plants, or another function, an industrial function. But that is itself is being driven by what? Our wants and our needs, people's. Healthcare, education, specialized focuses of what we're trying to deliver in a certain space, or to accommodate, or to catalyze, or to create the proper vessel, the vehicle, for the optimal. Really, I mean, generally speaking, optimal is what we're looking for, without suggesting that there's only the perfect solution, but optimal solutions, optimal ways of translating your needs and your wants and the reality of space and your interaction with space in the built environment into wonderful, functional, beautiful, hopefully, structures, spaces, places, buildings, the built environment, an outdoor area, a setting. Okay, so the context, first, because of the way it arises in us and the way it sort of gets engaged in architecture, is what do you want, what do you need? And we've talked about that throughout. But context for architecture in general, which is now why in general, because we're going to look at trends here, is what do we want? What do people want? What do people need? So for example, demographics. At the time of this show, 2017, okay, there are certain demographic trends and there are certain age group trends. Like soon on the horizon, there's going to be a particularly large demand for elderly housing, for example. So that's a trend, but that's less of the sort of big picture essence that I want to talk about with trends. However, that's no less important, probably more important. That's the very practical, specific, where the rubber meets the road. A lot of the specific trends are actually harder to predict than some of the bigger picture trends. And also the bigger picture trends, we don't necessarily say like within 3 years. We're saying like, well, it's coming. It's coming over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You know, we're just moving in that direction. So there's different ways of looking at the notion of trends. Before I get more into that, however, more about context. Oft overlooked, and it's interesting as to why this can be overlooked, is the physical reality. So, in which we build. Now, what I don't mean is the physics of how a beam carries a load. That we very much have been responsive to and very much incorporated it into a controlled analysis approach. etc. Some of the finer points of design that true artisans in the field seem to master without some of the analytical tools. And they have before the analytical tools really could exist because of lack of sort of calculating power, is light, and ventilation. These things are actually very complicated when you analyze them, but with the help of computers, we can. So that relates to a trend, which we'll get to next, of what we're able to incorporate consciously, purposefully, and accurately in our design with some of the new tools, and what more people are able to incorporate that they weren't before without these tools, even if a few geniuses here or there were able to without the tools, okay, or somebody who got lucky. And then there's trial and error kind of evolution of systems where you'll see in a vernacular architecture, they really figured out a perfectly sweet solution to ventilation or moisture control that one would have to presume probably took place over simply building again and again and again and modifying the building, a living, breathing thing, the building in this type of scenario. But what I was touching on with the physical context, the world we're in is not just the physics, not just the dynamics of the light and the air, the bigger dynamics of how those systems are working, like how much wood, if you're building out of wood, how much wood is in the area, how is it readily available. Now that's just a practical kind of economic view on it, like the price of steel went up, etc. But I am now touching on the greater ecological ramifications. Not first here, nothing, I'm not saying that shouldn't be looked at this way, or it should, but I'm not first looking at that from an ecological value basis, like an environmentalist view, even though if anything, I think somebody would characterize my views as that. But I'm not looking at it like that here first. I'm looking at it systematically, meaning how it behaves in the system of the context for architecture. And it relates more than just economically. It relates to resource and energy flows and availability and all of these things. It's so amazing. Nothing is isolated. So how we think about them, since we're driving most of these things variously when an actual, a specific project, I want this, I don't want that. If we think, whether or not it's accurate, that we should be prepared for a terrorist attack or something in a certain location, therefore I want a super thick wall. And really, let's say the statistical likelihood of that event happening is minuscule compared to, say, tornado, lightning strikes, hurricanes, high-speed winds, and all the relatives of other forms of damage, or somebody going out of control and driving into your building by mistake or something. However, if that's important to us for whatever reason, emotionally driven, fear, whatever the reason, that's just as, and actually more so, generally speaking, an element of how the context, yes, it exists in the outside world, then it changes the way we're thinking, and then we respond, potentially completely out of proportion to what's happening in the world. So it's just as important how we think about it, and more so generally. More important than how it, quote unquote, really is in the world, whatever that is, right? Well, what is that? Things you can measure. So, for example, air pollution or indoor air contaminants from a urea formaldehyde used as a binding resin for a plywood or something like that, let's say. The truth is, how much impact that might have on you and your family depends on many factors in your home. The amount of ventilation, etc., etc. However, again, if the context is two parts. One is that stuff is used in that to make that. The other part of the context is how much do you care about it. So they're never separate. So on the ecological front, the environmental front, the resource, the energy flows, the life cycle, the context is, so it would seem, the human race is having a greater impact via the number of people and the intensity of the processes, industrial, they could be characterized generally speaking, or on a grand commercial scale, enormous beef farms and whatnot, and clear cutting and stuff. Greater impact than it ever has in history, and this is affecting literally the context in which we build. The temperature, literally, greenhouse gases, the temperature ranges, and all these things. All of this is the context for architecture. And it's part of the trends. Why? Because so it would seem we're going to continue to, sadly, but so it would seem we're going to continue to, just wipe out, the number of fish in the sea, greater toxify the sea, emit more greenhouse gases. Even if we try to curb it, there's more people. So the trend is, whether in real life or just in your mind, so that's why I want to say sort of take it out of the mode of, wait, which is it, made up or not, and look at it as a context that's affecting the trend. So it's however it is in the real world, then how we generally think about it. What is that context? That context is there are issues on the ecological front relating to destruction of habitat, consuming too much energy, producing too much waste, making too much pollution. How do we protect ourselves from it? How do we do less damage, etc.? Okay, that is some of the physical context. Now, we talked a little bit about some of the specific drivers of trends, like a growing number of people in a certain age group that will need a certain type of accommodation. Okay, and that's real, and that's totally practical and accurate. There are some other things that we see coming down the pike, a lot of them driven by technology, because we just keep, even if we're messing up certain systems in the world, thus far we're just marching along with this amazing, just seen in and of itself. I'm not saying good or bad so much as just staggering in the power of the technological advances we're making and continue to make at an accelerating pace. Interconnectivity, the Internet of Things, responsiveness, 3D printing, modular construction, customizable, responsive fabrication, not just by yourself, but to third parties who can do it very cheaply because they have a grand economies of scale. You start to put all that together, and it's a little bit, what does that look like in particular? But, the notion, okay, now, there's things that are real-time responsive, we're doing it right now, but they're going to become more and more cost-effective, right? The more people use them, the more common they are, and the more they've been manufactured, the more the price is going to come down, as well as they're going to get better and better. So, occupancy sensors and the like, yes. Lighting, mood, music control, all of that is sort of software-based first. If you look at how is that happening and how is that getting so good, coupled with these, increasingly efficient and responsive devices that are all interconnectable. So there's the responsiveness of the real-time creation of space, let alone holographic possibilities that is like a virtual space within a space, which is coming. When? Who knows, okay? But all that relates to customizable, responsive space that's controllable, you can connect with at a distance potentially.
This episode continues in part 2. Key life.